director of the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown. And I'm also the director of Georgetown's STARTALK Tech program, which is hosting this webinar series for the participants of our course and also the wider community of language teachers. And so we're so excited today to have Dr. Fred Poole joining us from Michigan State University. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction and then I will hand things off to Fred. But we're grateful to our funder, the NSA, for making this series possible. I do want to, before we start, briefly plug our upcoming Summer StarTalk program, which is for introductory or intermediate learners of Chinese. So if you teach Chinese or work with students of Chinese at the college level, we would love to have them apply to our program. It's 1 week here at Georgetown in August of 2025, and it's taught using an entirely task-based language teaching approach, or TBLT approach. And so we're very excited for that and would welcome applications from interested students. So short plug for that program. But back to our topic at hand. Again, I want to thank Dr. Fred Poole, our speaker here today, for coming to speak with us. He was just telling me how much demand his work is in right now, which I absolutely believe, as we all just kind of deal with what AI means for us as language teachers and how we can use it. And so I'm really thrilled to have him talk about the intersection of AI and TBLT today. He works at Michigan State University as an assistant professor and faculty member in the Center for Language Teaching Advancement. And so his work focuses on the role of games in language learning, digital literacy, collaborative reading, and of course, artificial intelligence. So a tech guru who has thought a lot about different aspects of the intersection of technology and language teaching. And so I'm going to pass things over to Fred. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. Go ahead and get my screen shared, and then we can jump right into it. All right. So welcome, everybody, to my talk on using AI to enhance task-based language teaching. As Meg just mentioned, I'm at Michigan State University, where I work in the Master of Arts in Foreign Language Teaching program, in which we primarily work with in-service teachers. So a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today is a result of some of the reflections that I've had with the teachers that I work with, but also some of my own personal experiences as a language teacher. So I've got a packed 30 minutes that I'm getting ready to share, and I'm going to jump straight into it. And I think the first thing that we need to look at is why TBLT. If we're going to talk about AI, why are we focusing on AI with TBLT and not in some other aspect? And I think the simple answer is that for many people, task-based language teaching is really the gold standard for language teaching. And that's because its tasks mirror this real-world language use that can be so motivational to our learners who can see how their language skills will be used outside the classroom. It's focused on meaningful communication, and we're really developing implicit skills through interaction and negotiation of meaning. And I think one of the sort of touted benefits of TBLT is that it's really a flexible framework. Because we have a needs analysis, we can customize it to our context and to our learners. And even within the three phases of the framework, we have opportunities to apply implicit or explicit teaching strategies to really push language learning forward. And then finally, it's really a true learner-centered approach in which we're relying on our students' linguistic repertoire to sort of complete these tasks. And we can't talk about TBLT without defining what is a task. This is something that is sort of a must-do. I've pulled out 4 of the definitions of tasks that are fairly common that we see in the field, where Long says that they are things that people do in everyday life. Willis talks about tasks as being goal-based activities that involves learners' current linguistic skills. And then Ellis puts forth this idea that it's a work plan that involves processing of language, using current linguistic skills, sort of similar to Willis's definition there, that leads to an outcome that can be assessed by its communicative function. And I really like this Noonan's definition because he splits it between real-world tasks and pedagogical tasks to remind us that in the classroom, oftentimes, this might look a little bit different than what we see in the real world. Some of the key points that we need to remember about TBLT before diving into what AI can do for us is that TBLT, the task should be related to real-world communicative activities. There's a clearly defined non-linguistic outcome to this task. And this is important because this, one, keeps a focus on meaning, and it tells us when that task has been completed. And as a result of this non-linguistic outcome, learners should have to do something with the language, make a decision, make a choice, something to make it clear that they've completed that, that objective. And then finally, language must be used to complete the activity. There's a number of nonverbal tasks out there, and we're not looking at these. We're looking at ones that specifically relate to languages. So as I mentioned earlier, typically within a TBLT framework, we have a pre-task phase where we're providing our learners with input and opportunities to engage with language that's going to support them in completing a task. Then we have our main task phase, and then finally we have a post-task phase, which is a time for us to look at our performance in the task phase, reflect on some of the mistakes that we might have made, and get an opportunity to then do the task once again, once we've had an opportunity to make some adjustments. A key part of these of the TBLT framework is a needs analysis, which really is the main goal of this is to identify some real-world tasks that are appropriate for our learners' proficiency level, but also appropriate for their specific needs, their goals, and the context in which they are learning in, as well as determining some actual situation in which those language learners will use that language going forward. Now, the way that we determine this is typically through some data collection procedures such as interviews and surveys. We might be doing some observations or corpus analysis to determine what type of language our learners are going to need, as well as consulting some SMEs or subject matter experts. With the ultimate outcome of the needs analysis typically being a list of tasks or communicative activities that our students are going to need, and that ultimately will form the basis of our syllabus design or our materials development going forward. So if this is the gold standard, what are some of the challenges? Why don't we see TBLT everywhere? Well, and this is the part that's sort of coming from the conversations I have with teachers, but also my own experiences. But the first one is that a needs analysis is not terribly practical, if we're being completely honest. If our school districts, ideally our school districts would be doing this for us, but this doesn't always happening. And then to expect a teacher to take on this challenge is also not terribly practical, given how overworked and overburdened they already are. Some of the great examples of needs analysis I have seen are typically master's theses or a dissertation. These are just huge projects. The next challenge that we have is in defining a task. There's been a number of papers or studies out there that have shown that teachers tend to struggle with differentiating between a communicative activity versus a task. And even when they do define a task, the next challenge is coming up with a task that is relevant for each unit and lesson. One of the questions I always get is, do I really need a task for every unit? And if there's some units that just don't have a task, this can be quite challenging to think of all of these different tasks. And then once we do have a task, the next thing is we need to be able to generate enough material and pre-task activities to support those tasks. Typically, we have a textbook that already does this work for us, but if we're creating a unique syllabi for our context and for our learners, that means we also need to create the materials and tasks that go with it. And so this is a lot of work for us, to put it simply. And then finally, within the post-task phase, we're ideally analyzing that performance, but we need to do it in a timely manner so that our learners can take that analysis and then reapply it to the task as they try it again. If it takes too long, then we kind of lose the effect that we're really hoping to get. And so again, this is another thing that really burdens our teachers in the sense that that's a lot of analysis in a quick turnaround. So with these sort of 4 challenges put forth, that's the agenda that we're going to be looking at today in terms of how can AI facilitate a needs analysis? How can it help us generate tasks? How can it help us generate materials? And then finally, how can it analyze our performance within that task to give us suggestions and feedback on what we can do going forward? Now, I'm going to make a few assumptions in this presentation. The first one is that you all know what ChatGPT is, and maybe a few other LLMs like Claude and Gemini. I'm going to make the assumption that you've used these tools before. At the very least, you know how to prompt it. You've you get the user interface of what ChatGPT looks like. You also have a basic understanding of how AI generates texts, and you are interested in applying these tools to your language teaching context. I've been a part of many discussions and presentations where the discussion moves towards the idea of, should we be using these tools at all? And that's a very valid discussion, but it's not what we're talking about today. That would be a different talk. So before diving in, I want to share a few key principles and suggestions on general AI use that you will see me reiterating and applying throughout this presentation. The first suggestion I have for everybody interested in AI is to always bring AI to the table. This is something that Ethan Mollick says. If you're a language teacher, if you are a teacher educator, you should be thinking about every task that you have. Can AI help me? How can it help me? Try it out. If it doesn't work, throw it away and move on with your task. But it is only through this way that you'll start to learn what it is capable of, what it's not capable of, and thus you will eventually then become an informed user of these tools. The next thing, with anything that you're doing with AI, it's important that you first define the important concepts. So here, we want to be able to define a task. We want to define information gap activity. Anything that we're going to ask ChatGPT or AI to apply, we want to make sure that its definition is aligned with our own definition. Once we ask AI to define it, then we can make corrections to it. Next is to take an iterative approach to your prompts. Never assume that your first prompt is the best prompt. Generally, you're going to need 4 or 5 iterations before you get to that nice prompt that you're looking at. Provide AI that you're working with examples. There's a number of studies, my own studies included, that have shown that when you provide examples, you're going to get better output. And then finally, provide some clear delineations between your prompt and the examples that you provide. All right, now we can jump into it. So the first thing we're looking at is potential of using AI for a needs analysis. So I'm going to walk through this first example somewhat slow for us. And I started with this by simply asking ChatGPT, do you know what a needs analysis is according to a TBLT framework? This is me confirming that we are on the same page with the AI model. And I got a satisfactory response. It gave pretty much everything that we would be looking for with an AI. Now, my second prompt is digging in a little bit more. I'm asking ChatGPT, what information would you need from me to do a quasi-needs analysis on my class? Now, I'm calling this a quasi-needs analysis because I'm not out there collecting, I'm not out there doing interviews and surveys or doing a corpus analysis. I'm looking for something that's quick and dirty that I can gain information about my class that I'm working with. So I told ChatGPT that I can tell you about my students' age, their geographic location, their goals, their interests, their current proficiency level. And then I asked, is that enough? So what I'm doing here is I'm making sure, again, that me and ChatGPT are on the same page, that we are aligned in what it is that we're hoping to achieve here. And so this led to my third prompt, which is the one that I'm actually using. And so I tell GPT, okay, my students are high schoolers in Michigan. They are currently a novice high. Their short-term goal is to get to an intermediate low, and eventually they'd like to major in Chinese and maybe travel to China. But importantly, and this is something GPT told me, that they need to know where my students can currently use their language. So I said, well, most likely they can only use their language skills online or potentially at places around town that have Chinese speakers or actual or cultural events. And then I put in another, a little bit more information down here about their interests, which include things like pop culture, social media, influencers, music, new movies, and so on. Now, I could have collected a survey from my students and asked them about their goals and asked them about their interests. And if I did so, I could literally take that Excel document and drop that into AI and use that as the foundation for my needs analysis. So what did I get here? Well, GPT gave me 6 groups of tasks and topics that I can then integrate into my classroom. So the first one looks quite familiar to us. Introduce yourself and your interests, describe your daily routine, describe your hometown, plan a weekend activity, discuss a favorite movie or song, attend a cultural event, right? If you'll notice within each one of these groups, there's common themes. This is something that I also asked ChatGPT to do in a follow-up prompt. And I told GPT to organize this from the easiest to the most difficult, but keep common themes together within the same group. So it gave me 6 groups. The group 3 is food and shopping. Group 4 is school and social media. Group 5 is travel and directions. Group 6, community and future goals. And then at the end, we get a nice sequence overview. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that the affordance of AI, and this is an important message for us, the affordance of AI is not its content accuracy. It's going to be the speed at which it generates material and the quantity. So if I didn't like these 15 tasks, I can very quickly say, give me 30 more. And then I, as the teacher, now become the evaluator. I have now as much material as I need, and I can start to move these tasks around and put them in the order that I see fit and choose the ones that I think are going to be most useful to my learners. But we do have a few problems with this needs analysis. It's a nice place to start. It gives us a nice overview for something that may be more tailored to our students. But if you looked at some of those tasks, they're not actually tasks. They're more or less communicative activities. Describe your home is not really a task that we're looking for. And as I mentioned, while we do have a plan, we don't have materials or activities yet. But this is still a nice place for us to sort of start. And then we can start diving in a little bit deeper and get what we're really looking for with the next part, which is the task generation. But before looking at task generation, I think it's important to first take a moment and reflect on the difference between communicative activities and what a task is. So here I have 2 fairly common communicative activities that we will see in the CLT classroom. On the left, we have question strips where a teacher might cut these up, give them to each one of the students in the class, and have students walk around mingling, asking questions and exchanging their strips. And on the other one, we have a find someone activity where we're going to walk around the classroom and find someone who likes to read or find someone who has a dog. Now, both of these activities involve some level of communication. We are asking questions, we're exchanging information, but they're not tasks because we don't have a purpose. We don't have an objective. There's nothing that we're trying to accomplish here. But we can very quickly turn these into a task just by adding some framing to this, right? So our first one, we could turn this into a choose an apartment to rent task. Now we have a reason to talk about the kitchen and why we like big kitchens versus little kitchens and what we're willing to do in the kitchen. We have a reason to use this activity. Same thing with the find someone activity. We can turn this into choose a roommate. You are going to be living at a private high school or a boarding school, and you need to choose somebody within this classroom that you might want to live with, right? Now there's a purpose to asking these questions and finding out this information. Oh, so there's a number of approaches that we can take to identifying tasks. We can do grammar-driven ones. Some of my teachers have a very specific grammar that they want to teach, and so we can think about real-world tasks that involve prepositions of place. We can think of real-world tasks that involve animals, so a theme-driven approach. Or we can, look at our textbook and think of a real-world task that would involve chapter 2. Ideally, if we're going from a needs analysis perspective, we want to do something that's student-driven. So how do your students use your language in a typical day? What do they talk about? What decisions do they make, right? Once we have that real-world task, our next goal is going to be to turn this into some type of a pedagogical task. Our pedagogical tasks, many of you are probably familiar with, are things like an information gap activity, where we have a pair of students, where student A has a picture, chart or menu or something, and then student B needs that information. Problem solving would be the same thing, but now they need to work together to find a solution together. Decision making, also the same thing, but they have to make a decision exchanging that information. And then an opinion gap involves asking others real questions about ideas and preferences. And then finally, a jigsaw activity would be having group members with different information that they then need to exchange. So other important questions that I typically will ask my learners as they're reflecting on the pedagogical tasks that they're creating is the first thing, is this task relevant to my learners, first and foremost? Second, why are we doing this task? If the only thing that we're saying, the only answer that we have to why we are doing this task is to learn how to talk about the kitchen, this is a clear indicator that we are still doing a communicative activity and not necessarily a task. There needs to be some other objective here. And one way that can help us is to be thinking about who is involved. Who are the roles in this task? What are their motives? Having these clear objectives is going to help us contextualize and contain that activity, right? And then what are the real world limitations that we're placing on the task? If we're asking our students to identify an apartment, we're only going to give them $1,500. they have to find 3 bedrooms for their roommates. These sort of limitations are going to establish a gap and establish a need to exchange information. All right, so we have all that information. We might also already have a few tasks that we like to use. These are some tasks that I've used in my classrooms in the past. They all have a fairly similar structure. I'm going to highlight this middle one, pick a tourist attraction to visit, for a reason you'll see why here in a minute. But in this one, I've divided my students into groups, and for each group, I'm going to give them a simple description of something they can do in our town, such as go to the zoo, go to the museum, or an amusement park. It's going to include prices. It'll include information about what they can see at these places, among other things. So students will read the lists in one group, and then, so one group will read about the zoo, one will read about the museum, one about the amusement park. And then they're going to split up and they're going to go form a new group, and they're going to share that information about each one of these places. And then they'll have to have a discussion, decide which one they're going to visit. So this is a task that I like a lot, and I can build all of my all of my curriculum around this task. And it's a nice example. So what does this look like for task generation into AI? So what I have here is I'm asking AI, can you generate 5 tasks that are similar to this one? So it's really important. I have a model. GPT is going to perform much better if we have a model. So I include the model here in italics. And then I remind ChatGPT this task should involve an information gap. There should be a non-linguistic outcome at the end. It should be relevant. It should be appropriate for novice learners. And then please include a mixture of information gap, decision-making, jigsaw. I've included all that information that we've talked to up to this point. If I wanted to go further, I could even include a more descriptive definition of these novice high learners. And so with this task generation, we should also be looking back at our needs analysis and identifying some of those major communicative situations that were identified earlier as sort of inspiration for the tasks that we want to be generating here. And now what I get here is I'm only showing 3, but I actually generated 10. And all of these are coming straight from GPT, and they have the exact same model that I had before. It starts off contextualizing who's involved. Students are divided into groups. They have to describe a place. They need to go on a travel destination to either Paris, Tokyo, or Bali. This one's very similar to mine, except for instead of going to tourist attractions in town, we're looking at cities that we might want to visit. And again, just to remind us about the affordance of GPT is that once we have this prompt, all we have to do is replace this italics for any of the communicative activities we did before and generate 10 tasks for each one. Now we can very quickly, again, become the evaluator, pick which task we think is most suitable for the unit that we are teaching, and then move on to our next step. So for this one, I'm going to just use our travel destinations as our example going forward. And so within this one, each member of the group is given information about a different travel destination, Paris, Tokyo, or Bali. I'm going to give them a reading card that tells them about the temperature, the weather, the major sites, the food, the things they have, the things that's special about that city. And this is going to give them all the information that they need to make a decision about which city they're going to want to visit. So now we've moved on to the pre-task phase. And in the pre-task phase, again, we want to provide our learners with input and activities to prepare them to be able to complete this task using their own linguistic repertoire. So one thing I want to point out here, and this is maybe a misconception that often happens with these 3 phases, is that we don't spend the same amount of time in all 3 of these phases. A majority of our time should be spent in this pre-task phase. Oftentimes teachers think that, oh, day 1 is pre-task, day 2 is main task, day 3 is post. In my mind, a lot of times our pre-task phase might actually be a week. Whatever that looks like in your context, it may be different, but the key here is we're spending a lot of time in this pre-task phase to prepare our learners for that main task. And that means that we need a lot of activities within that phase. We can be doing things like providing a demonstration of an ideal performance, analyzing the features of an ideal text, an open-ended discussion on a topic at hand, or brainstorming, listing, and organizing activities. Whenever we're looking at our pre-task, we want to consider our main task. What is the language that our learners will use in that main task? And how does our pre-task phase model that main task? And are you drawing attention to the new vocabulary and forms that your learners may be unfamiliar with in that pre-task phase? And then finally, how are you supporting comprehension during that modeling point? So here's an example of some pre-task phases that I've done with my identify an apartment task, where I might start off by first telling my learners about my own apartment. And I'll give them a checklist where they're listening to each room in my house. And I'll tell them, I love the bedroom because it's, really big, but I hate my kitchen because it's too small. And they'll check off whether I like or dislike each room. And then the next activity is they'll compare what they heard and what they checked off with a partner. Did they hear the same things? Did they have differences? Then they'll use the same checklist to describe their own house the way that I described mine. Then they'll move on to whose house is better, your house or mine. And then they'll move on to a jigsaw activity. And then they'll move on to an activity where they're sorting apartment ads. So we have a number of activities that are building toward this ultimate task of choosing an apartment. So now we have another massive prompt of taking everything that we know about the pre-task phase. We start off by reminding ChatGPT that our pre-task phase should be focused on meaning. It should provide listening or reading input. It should use input flood, input enhancement. It should be using all of these strategies. We also remind ChatGPT that it should be that it can use activities such as demonstration of task performance, analyzing features of a text, and so on. And then towards the end here, I give it the list of activities that I did with identifying an apartment to give it examples. And then finally, at the bottom here, I say, please generate 5 pre-task activities for this main task. And then I copy and paste the task that I borrowed earlier. And again, very quickly, we get 4 or 5 pre-task activities that are aligned with how I view these pre-task activities should be in my classroom. So you can start to see that how this can really increase our efficiency in terms of generating tasks, generating activities for it. But now we need material. We need material that our students are going to be engaging with, right? So moving on to material generation, there's a number of things that we can do. For the same task of deciding where we're going to go, I generated a dialogue by asking ChatGPT to imagine that 2 students were completing this task in the classroom. What would it look like if they were at the intermediate mid level? What would happen if they were at the intermediate low? So now I can get scaffolded or graded readers of a dialogue depending on their proficiency level. I could also generate advertisements for each one of these cities that are at the proficiency level for these students. And then I can even create the information gap cards. If you can notice up here, we have an information card for Paris, Tokyo, and Bali. This took me all of 1 minute to generate, and it's very simple. It's very simple language on here. We have activities, visit the Eiffel Tower. Yeah, I'm not going to read too much French here, but go to the go to the Louvre. We can get the weather. We get accommodations. What's special about each one of these cities, and why would I visit it? Right now, everything is prepared for this task activity that I'm getting ready to do. The key thing with AI is that if we're bringing it to the table, we have to be creative and think outside of the box. There are many things that we can be generating here. It's not just dialogues, but it's also a Twitter thread about your favorite place to visit. It can be a blog post that you want to. You can create a script from a movie, songs, be creative, but also don't forget to be pedagogical. One of the things, if we're using GPT to generate text, we have to remember that the texts here are not necessarily authentic material as much as they look like it, because these texts don't necessarily have a purpose or a motive. But one thing that we can do with GPT is we can upload an authentic text and ask ChatGPT to simplify it. We need to clarify how we want it simplified. But once we start with an authentic text and then we simplify it, we can create graded input that eventually scaffolds our students' approach to an authentic text. So we can create graded readers, we can create modified elaborated input, if you're familiar with this, but we do need to teach GPT how to do that first. We can create narrow reading exercises. All of these strategies that you're doing in your classrooms already, GPT can do it, but faster and on a larger scale. One resource that I want to share with everybody is diffit.me. This is a very useful resource. It is a AI enhanced tool that was designed specifically for creating simplified and graded material. You can come here and upload if you click right here on any text or excerpt, you can upload an authentic text and then very quickly choose the language and the grade level. Now it goes from 1st grade all the way to 12th grade. And I don't think that these actually align with a second grade reading level or a 10th grade reading level. But the key here is that they are at different different benchmarks. So if you have an authentic text, you can create one at second grade level, one at a 5th grade level, and one at an 8th grade level. And again, very quickly, you're creating material for your classroom. Diffit provides you with not only the simplified text, but also a summary, key vocabulary words and lists if you want something for your students to be able to study, as well as comprehension questions and exercises. And all of this is free at the moment. So now we move into the post-task phase. And within the post-task phase, again, we're looking at having a reflection on the performance of the task. This is where we want to draw attention to form and provide maybe explicit instruction on what our learners can do better the next time that they engage in this task. So the ultimate goal being here is a repeat of performance. When they're reflecting on task performance, we might ask our students to summarize the outcome of the task, reflect and evaluate their own performance in a self-assessment. We might ask them to think about which language use they gave primacy to, whether that be fluency, complexity, or accuracy. They could discuss communication problems, among a number of other tasks. So where does AI come into this part? Well, with all of these new AI tools, one of the things that we also get is better transcription software. So Mac Whisper, unfortunately, it can only be used on Macs, but it is a multilingual audio transcriber that works very well with different languages. So while you all may be familiar with Otter AI that usually works with English, Mac Whisper can very easily handle translanguaging multiple languages. And now once we have a transcript of our students' performances, we can ask AI to summarize the task. And then students can compare their own summaries to the AI summary. We can ask AI to identify trends or even provide suggestions. This is something that I use even as recently as 5 days ago when I was preparing for a Chinese presentation on the use of AI for assessments. Chinese being my L2 language, I first recorded my speech, and then I asked ChatGPT, are there any words that I should have been including in this speech? Are there any phrases that are common to this type of speech that I didn't use? Once I get that feedback, I can then try again and integrate these new words and phrases. We can also simply ask ChatGPT to create a self-assessment or create a checklist that should have happened within the task performance so that our students can reflect on the task performance themselves. So I'm going to end here with an example that I did just recently where I asked ChatGPT on the app. I used the audio function, and I do encourage you to use the audio function in your L2 because it's quite naturalistic and works quite well. But I did this one in Spanish, and I asked ChatGPT to pretend that it was a language partner with me in the classroom. And ChatGPT started off and said, well, I said that we need to pick if we're going to go to Paris or Beijing. And ChatGPT starts off by trying to convince me that we need to go to Paris because of all of the museums, like the Louvre. And I said, yeah, but Beijing's got a lot of museums too. And ChatGPT said, yeah, but Paris is more romantic. And it's also easier to walk. And I said, yeah, but China is going to be cheaper than Paris, and we can take taxis anywhere we want to go. And then we went back and forth, and eventually I convinced AI that we should go to Beijing. Now, because I did this in the app, at the end, I got a transcript of our entire conversation, and I could ask ChatGPT, identify all of the mistakes that I made. Tell me what was the mistake and what I should have said, right? Now that I get that feedback, I can very quickly look at some of the mistakes I made and then do the task again and try to correct those mistakes and to apply the feedback that I got right away. So this leads to our concluding thoughts. The first thing I want to conclude with is that you as language teachers are the human in the loop. And what that means, and what I hope that I've shown in this presentation, is that this tool can be very powerful, but it's only as powerful as the expertise that you put into it. That is your role as a human in the loop, is that you are defining very clearly what it is you want out of it. You are the evaluator of what's good and bad out of it, and you need to remain in the loop. So that's the second part of that statement, is to make sure you stay in the loop. And that means you have to continue developing your expertise in things like SLA and teaching methods and so on. if you ever get to a point where you have nothing to add to the AI, that's when we run into all of these problems that people have been worried about with AI in society. The next thing is to always bring AI to the table. The more you bring it to the table, the more you're going to learn about what it can do, and the more you're going to expand these capabilities. Similar to what I was saying earlier, be creative. It's not just generating text. It can generate just about anything we want if we're creative and if we're constantly working with it iteratively. Number 3, never assume that your first prompt is your best. This one we've stated a number of times. Number 4, AI's affordance is not accuracy. It's not creating authentic text. Its affordance is speed and quantity, taking what you do and multiplying it. And then finally, this is just one part of integrating AI into language education. There's several other things that we should be considering, such as the ethical, societal, and environmental concerns around ChatGPT. We also need to be thinking about the AI policies that we have for our learners and how we address cheating, and hopefully we do so with transparency or establishing transparency and trust as values in our classroom. So I'm going to end here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Fred. Well, I'll open the floor for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or unmute and ask questions. Okay, and I'll get started with one of my kind of practical